Hello.
Hello.
Hello. It worked. How wonderful to see you, Theodore.
I am very happy to meet you, who are a great fighter.
A fighter.
Against tremendous odds. Very difficult to defeat.
Yes, but I loved the last bit of your conversation that you were having there about languages, because I just came from my lunch table in my home, and we had my 4 children, my husband, and we were speaking. Every sentence seemed to be half in Italian and half in English. And I realized at one point, one of my kids said, "Can we just choose one language?" Anyway,
nice to speak in 2 languages.
it is. But when the same sentence goes in and out 2 or 3 times, it's quite funny.
And it seems to me that in countries which don't claim to dominate the world, yes, they feel their own language is enough.
Yes, and they're also honored. Well, it's quite interesting in Italy, for example, where I'm from, when someone makes an effort to speak Italian, even if they speak it terribly, the Italians embrace them and say, "That's wonderful." Whereas I haven't had that experience in France, for example.
Yes, well, Italian and French is,
Anyway, so yeah. So why did you call me a fighter?
Because you are trying to find, or saying things in economics which annoy everybody, more or less. And that's something I want to discuss with you, because you have pointed out rightly the role that the state has played in innovation. And I would interpret it this way. In the beginning, it was not the state, it was the potentate, the rich persons who were able to ask great engineers or whatever to do something by their own free will. And the snag I find in your argument is that the state is now managed by people quite often who have completely different ambitions. And secondly, that most states are bankrupt.
Good point. So, where to begin? So first of all, the state doesn't exist in one, big blob form. There's different types of states. They're managed in different ways. And even within a state, the different institutions that a state might have. If we just, instead of using the word state, think of the public sector, right? As different as the BBC in the UK, which is funded with public money, to a Department of Defense, yeah? So I think coming to your first point about maybe the lack of management capacity, that's not inevitable. If you think of a private sector company, they are able to manage production lines and innovation because they also invest in that capacity. There's business schools all over the world that teach CEOs how to do strategic management, decision sciences, organizational behavior, all these sexy words. And the state, because, this is my take, because we often pretend that it's just there to fix problems when they arise. In economics speak, we call it fixing market failures. Then actually there hasn't necessarily been a justification for being really ambitious and investing within the state in dynamic capabilities and capacity. And in fact, that's also been linked with outsourcing of that capacity to, for example, the consulting companies, which you mentioned before Brexit. I would love it if someone actually researched how much the consulting companies are getting, the big 4, PricewaterhouseCoopers, KPMG, Deloitte, by managing Brexit or mismanaging it for the UK government. There's lots of outsourcing of all sorts of different services, from prisons to hospitals to also something as complicated as Brexit.
But do you agree that the motivation of people who seek to manage the state is maintenance in office? They have got to win the next election.
I think broadly that's true, of course, in the sense that there is an election every 4 or 5 years, depending which country we're looking at. But I think that would be unfair to argue that people enter the public service just to have a job and to have the job again and again. I think actually, at least in principle, the reason people do enter the public service, even though their salary might be much lower than, say, working at Goldman Sachs, is actually a sincere belief in the public service, in the civic sense. The problem is that if we actually don't have, coming back to this issue of also capabilities, capacities, metrics, remits, and an open discussion within society, what is the state? What is it for? Then, all sorts of negative things can happen. And you can have states, forget the bad states, the dictatorships and the sort of malignant, explicitly malignant states, but you can have just a lot of uselessness, right? You can have states that do, for example, perhaps what the private sector should be doing, but is not doing properly, and just fill that gap, or do what they maybe should be doing, but in a very unambitious, bureaucratic, boring, inertial way. But there's nothing in the DNA of the state that should make it so, right? Coming back to that word you use, management, I mean, we should really be building the most creative bureaucracies. There's no reason the word bureaucratic should be a negative word, by the way. I use it all the time. I say, that's such a bureaucratic kind of Kafkian procedure, but there's no reason bureaucratic as an adjective should be negative. We can have really dynamic bureaucracies.
Have you spent time in the government?
I work with governments all the time, and I work inside their office. You mean as a civil servant? No. I mean,
not as a civil servant, but you've experienced governments.
Yes. I've worked very patiently with many governments, actually setting up also some institutions. Recently in Scotland, we set up a public bank. But just coming back to your point, the question is, what is the state actually doing? So if you, in theory, let's just pretend we're in complete utopia. What you could have states doing today is saying, hey, we've agreed to 17 sustainable development goals globally, right? Most states have. We now need to rethink our tools, procurement policy, grants, loans, prize schemes, to really crowd in, bottom-up experimentation across society through, well-designed, creative public levers like procurement, which I think people often forget just how big it is in the public budget, to be as creative as possible to, again, tackle those goals and have, kind of moonshots or missions within them. That's kind of what I've been doing recently with lots of states thinking about that. But that's not what we have.
Question I want to ask you is it possible that the 1% who own a great deal of money and who are unsure about what to do with it can be persuaded to do what the state does not do? At the moment, the use of that money is very inadequate and very often is to do with self-promotion or mistaken views about what is the most important thing to do.
Do you mean in the private sector or in the public sector?
Private sector, the 1% who own half the wealth, or whatever it is. Well, you've had experience of both sectors. What's your opinion? I found that the 1% have so many bees in their bonnets that you can very rarely tell them that this is more important than building, a new chemistry laboratory in some university.
Well, first of all, I'm not sure the first question is, why do the 1% have so much wealth? And what I've written about is that by ignoring the role of other actors in the economy in creating wealth in the first place, including, but not only the public sector, we have ended up, for example, socializing risks in different sectors, including in digital sectors, in the health sector, increasingly in the energy sector, but then privatizing the rewards. So it's not just about factors like deregulation, that many have written about. The narrative and the story we actually talk about in terms of where wealth comes from has been very siloed, very narrow, and that has been used partly, that is part of the reason I think that the 1% have also managed to have so much wealth. If you look at, in my book, The Entrepreneurial State, I looked at all the technology that makes our iPhone smart and not stupid. It was all state funded, internet, GPS, Siri, touchscreen display, every time your kids mess up your phone with their fingers, that technology was actually invented by the CIA. So the question is, just take Silicon Valley just for a minute. The 1% are not just in Silicon Valley, but a lot of those companies are. one could argue not so much what should they be using their money for, but where did that money actually come from? How could it be that companies whose wealth is very much a result of a social infrastructure and a social investment and very much a public investment have managed to capture so much of the rewards? And I do think that's the first question. The second question is, given what they have, what should they do with the money? Firstly, definitely reinvest. A lot of, in the last 10 years, $4 trillion have been used by the Fortune 500 companies just to buy back their own shares, to boost share prices, stock options, and executive pay. That's definitely not a good use of the money. But even the reinvestment, when it does happen, the question is, who should decide how these massive profits are spent? And again, in sectors like, if we think of the COVID moment now, so the healthcare crisis, in sectors like big pharma, where something like 75% of the drugs that are out there trace their research back to public spend, you could actually have a bit more of a deal, a negotiation between the public and private on all sorts of issues, including directionality. Where are the big kind of areas that funding should be going to? For example, antibiotics and vaccines that are very much underfinanced. Who should decide that?
If we turn away from money to what you have said about values, which I found very interesting. You talk about subjectivity being introduced into this. And what you say is very valuable. And how can one develop this further? What is your idea about how this can be developed further?
Well, just, so our listeners understand what I mean by subjectivity, because the word can mean all sorts of different things in different fields. Basically, what I argue is that the theory of value, how economists have actually thought about, what is value, used to be in the times of Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and Karl Marx, tied to objective conditions of production. So, this is why Adam Smith was so obsessed with the division of labor. He had this whole example of the pin factory in The Wealth of Nations, looking at how an increase in the division of labor would increase productivity, growth, and the wealth of nations. Karl Marx looked a lot at, the relationship between capital and labor. So did David Ricardo. They were all very concerned with rent in terms of value extraction. Anyway, in neoclassical economics, the current type of economic theory that drives, what's being taught all around the world, they transform this interest in the objective, not as a deterministic objective, but objective meaning literally who's doing what, in society and who's earning what from that, to the subjective. So all the attention in modern economic theory is on individual choices. So consumers are maximizing their utility, another word for happiness per price. Firms are maximizing their profits. Workers are assumed to be maximizing their preference for leisure versus work. So
I might say that happiness is where economists have gone astray.
Yeah.
They have misunderstood happiness.
Exactly. But this focus on individuals' decisions is sort of a subjectification of value, because what ended up happening in economics is that this assumption that everyone's maximizing their own kind of individual decisions, and then we aggregate that up and we form these famous supply and demand curves, which form equilibrium prices. And what we have been doing recently, including how we calculate GDP, is we assume then that the price reveals value. So we've reversed the causation, whereas in Marx, Smith, and Ricardo, they had a theory of value that determined the theory of price. What we have today is a theory of price that determines what we value. And that confusion, messes up a lot of things.
When we have more time, because we can't, I would like to discuss with you further how one can develop this idea of subjectivity into what it is that individuals can profit from their work. And what I really wanted to talk to you about was how we could change work so that, because work is where we spend our time, and how most work is boring or damaging to the mind or of no point. And this is the issue which I'd like economics to think about.
Very good. Do you know that the first sentence in the Italian Constitution is Italy is a country founded on work. I love it.
Really, really.
Yeah, it's the first sentence. So you would think that if that's the first sentence, there'd be a huge debate constantly about work, its quality, as you say, the level of alienation that people might have in working conditions. But no, I think in most advanced societies,
Yes.
work is sort of something on the periphery in terms of what we talk about, but it's central. You're absolutely right. It's central to our
That I would
core.
like with you, who's an open-minded economist, to see how one can reinvent each profession, each occupation,
Mm,
with the purpose of making it something which enhances the life of the individual, which makes them more intelligent, more sociable, more interested in other things.
yeah,
Whereas at the moment, it's just about earning money
yeah,
in order to have money in which to live in
yeah.
the spare time. So work is the basis of it all, and it is a disaster at the moment. And
Yeah.
to answer the question we are being posed, I would say that we've got to reinvent work.
Yes. You know, one thing I've been thinking about very recently on this theme is what is the modern day equivalent of the weekend? If you think about it, the weekend exists, as does the 8-hour workday, because those organizations defending workers, trade unions, fought for it. You know, we all enjoy the weekend, but it was fought for. People died to get us the weekend. And I often wonder, what's the equivalent today of the weekend, right? Which modern day progressive trade unions would ideally be fighting for. So this would be a benefit that everyone, even those not in unions, maybe even not in, you know, in work or in a traditional kind of work, benefit from.
Okay, sometime can we discuss
Yes.
what economists will allow, what therefore the state will contribute to, because financing this reinvention of work is quite difficult.
Yeah.
And that is why I was thinking that one ought to get a 1% to do it rather than the state, which has got so many obligations and so many debts and so on.
Yeah, but debt is a manufactured concept, right? I mean, at least in countries with sovereign currency, money's created all the time. When countries go to war, including the UK government, the US government, whether it's, you know, World War II or Afghanistan, Iraq, etc., you never hear governments say, "Oh, sorry, there's no money, we can't go." They create the money. So the real question is, what are the priorities we have today? So, for example, a green transition, it has to, of course, be financed by both public and private. But coming to your point about work, there would be all sorts of new jobs and skills required, and how to make sure that they are as purposeful or purposeful, and that we really together reimagine the kind of society we want to work in. I think we need new forum. We need things like citizen assemblies actually really talking about this. It shouldn't be handed down from above, whether it's from the so-called 1%, the state, or academics like you and I.
I mean, academics are free to both to think freely, but also, in my view, to remember what has happened in the past.
Yes.
And that is what modernity prevents. Modernity says what happened in the past should be forgotten. And we need to see all the mistakes our ancestors made and how we've got into this mess of people spending their lives looking at a computer.
Yeah. David Graeber, who unfortunately just passed away recently, an LSE historian. Yes, very sadly.
Really?
Just a couple of weeks ago, he wrote that wonderful book, Bullshit Jobs.
You know, I might say he's done it in much too limited a way.
Okay.
He hasn't taken the whole possibilities of humanity into account.
Yes, well, exactly. And I think, I mean, I'm not as familiar with his work probably as you, and hopefully his students can in his memory also develop this work further with imagination, as you say. But the question is, who defines? Yeah, I mean, what kind of jobs we have also very much depend on what kind of society we're building. So I do think there's this question about what does a sustainable, inclusive economy steer towards, again, coming back to the SDGs, and what are all the different, work and skills that we require to really tackle these challenges head on. And I think many of those jobs haven't been invented yet.
Yeah, it depends on our imagination. Our imagination is developed by seeing, experimenting, discovering what has been tried in many different places over many different centuries, and enhancing our vision of what the future is about.
Yeah,
I give a lot of, I believe that one cannot have an idea of the future without having memories of the past, because it is from the past that we see what has gone wrong.
yeah.
And when we have no memories, we have dementia.
Absolutely. I mean, unfortunately, within the economy, we keep making the same mistake over and over again. And we absolutely have a demented economy in that sense, crisis after crisis. But I think one danger in looking too much at the past is we have had a very narrow group of voices and experiences which have defined, what the problems are. I was speaking recently to Francis Morris, the head of the Tate Modern, and we might be working together on a concept of, or thinking about how do you measure the value that is created by a museum like the Tate Modern, which is a public museum, because the Treasury, of course, has to do its valuations in order to decide where to, put its money, how much to give all the different types of institutions, whether it's an art museum or, again, a health agency. And it's incredible how narrow we, again, value something like art. And, the role of the Tate has been very much to bring in new audiences, people who've never been to a museum, who are going for the first time, but also new artists to exhibit very different types of artists, for example, in the BAME community, which historically have not been exhibited for all the reasons we know with power of the incumbents. So I think looking at the past, but being willing to disrupt it with new voices and to be quite questioning about how we view, how we even understand our society. I think we require both.
Well, perhaps you can stimulate the Treasury to have different kinds of thoughts.
Yeah. Well, one thing that the Treasury needs to do is understand randomness more. I often say that getting to the moon and back again in one generation, which was the big feat of 50 years ago, a lot of the interesting things happen along the way. Not so much randomly, but by mistake, serendipity. The search for one thing led to the discovery of something else. The whole software industry emerged from trying to get to the moon. So how do you measure that? How do you actually evaluate what we call dynamic spillovers, kind of feedback effects, these loopy things, serendipitous things that happen along the way, which got us the software industry,
Well, because by looking at the past, you see that you do not discover things by searching for a particular thing. You find things on the way.
Exactly.
And you end up, when publishers say, please write a book on this, no, it's impossible to know what you're going to write in the book. You will find out when you finish it.
Exactly. That's the problem with the research grants. I don't know in your field, but in our field, we're constantly being asked to get these grants, which of course we do, but it's a very stupid question to ask an academic, tell us what your outputs will be. Well, there's no point in doing the research if I know the outputs, or what will be the deliverables. I don't know, we'll see. So of course we have to put something down, and we do, but along the way, all sorts of weird outputs occur.
Let this be your next ambition, to make all these grant people, which equate with the 1%, able to think about how new ideas are created.
Yeah, but we need to be careful. Don't let the 1% do the grants. I think that's a huge risk. The New York Times, by the way, has a great article on this. I think 5 years ago, it was called The Privatization of Science. Because we're cutting public budgets constantly for the wrong reasons, there's nothing, again, inevitable in having to worry about the debt and the deficit, then actually a massive gap has occurred, a hole has occurred within the funding, whether it's of the arts, the humanities, the sciences, which the private sector is filling. And that brings us back to the Middle Ages, the medieval times, exactly as you began your wonderful beginning when you said, back then we had the kings and the queens, funding science. Well, yes, and that was full of secrecy. It was full of random things. They had their pet projects. They wanted to be known, so they, funded things with no peer review. So what's good in the modern grant system is there's peer review. If that peer review, though, is too, again, narrow, of course, we need to fight against that. But you don't want just, the rich and famous funding, I don't know, garage fusion. I say that because my father has dedicated his entire life to nuclear fusion and, in big laboratories. And nowadays it's quite common to pretend you're going to do fusion in the garage. And that is getting huge amounts of money from the 1%. And you wonder where they're getting their knowledge from by funding these strange experiments.
The great problem with peer review is, of course, that if you have a new idea, everybody will, all the people in the established speciality will say this is rubbish.
That's the point about the disruption. Absolutely. That's the tension. You want the peer review, so you want some sort of rigor, but you want it to be very open and permeable and allow some craziness.
When I was tutor admissions in Oxford, I would admit people who had no qualifications because I thought they were bright.
Huh.
And that was stopped by administrations and so on. But if you just judge people on their qualifications, that's not enough.
Yeah.
We're talking about imagination. And the imagination is often wrong, often mad. And so one is looking for people who are willing to break away, because as we talk about the green world we're trying to create, I'm sure when we create it, we will still be quarreling. We'll still be doing stupid things exactly as before. It's got to be a different green world.
Yeah. And
who is preparing that?
Exactly. But also, again, who's defining it, right? So in the work we're doing with cities, coming back to this point of bringing as many different voices and, citizen groups, students, and again, trade unions and different voices to the table to even define what is a green city, what is a sustainable city, who's defining that?
No, you have to trust individuals to experiment. You give them small experiments. Only then do you see what 1 out of 100 will work, perhaps. You must be willing to waste money.
But don't you think there's a risk that if we talk too much, coming back to what we were saying before, the individualization of the concept of value, that if we focus too much on, give power to the so-called individuals, then there's this over-reliance on some sort of bottom-up process. It doesn't have a direction, so it gets dispersed, and the parts don't sum up to anything interesting. So this constant tension between providing a direction, for example, around a green transition, and make sure that we're tilting the playing field in that direction, but also allowing as much experimentation and serendipity and crazy stuff to happen bottom up. It's that very difficult tension. You sometimes have societies that are too directed, or ones that end up, again, too bottom up.
Well, one of the things I did when I wrote my history of French passions, I went to the library and I read all the doctoral theses about the application of laws and regulations. And I discovered that they never achieve what they claim to achieve.
Interesting. Doesn't that depend on the form of law, on the degree to which it's allowed to be interpreted?
All kinds of laws. And nobody had actually looked at these theses, and they go back a long time, because the results of any state activity is seldom what the state intended.
Yeah.
They didn't intend to produce all this inequality.
That's true with Viagra, right? It wasn't meant to do what it's doing. It was meant to be for the heart, and then something else went up. That is true of most innovation. Most innovations that we have today are due to a problem that was set, which wasn't focused on what we end up with, including the internet, right? The internet was not focused on as the internet. The question was, we needed the satellites to communicate, and the internet then allowed that to happen. But the question is, what are the problems we're even asking ourselves today that need solutions? And if they're too narrow and boring, that's going to affect also the type of spillovers we get.
You're a very influential person, and one has to influence the influential people in order to produce exceptions to the rule.